Have you ever watched someone lose everything and still hold their head high? In the gray mist of Hollowport, the ships of the Crown rest heavy on the harbor, their flags like chains against the wind. And among those cobblestone streets walks a woman, alone, forgotten, yet unbroken. Martha Hale, widow of a patriot. Her husband fell for freedom, while the officers who ordered his death now sip imported wine just beyond her shop window. They call her ungrateful. They mock her poverty. They buy her cloth only to tear it before her eyes, laughing as if her suffering were some game of empire. But in her silence, something stirs, a strength they cannot see, because humiliation breeds defiance, and the fire of dignity burns hottest in the coldest hearts. Stay with me until the end. What you are about to hear may change how you see sacrifice itself. For in the port town of Hollowport, where loyalty has a price and betrayal wears a red coat, the widow's quiet hands are about to sow the first threads of rebellion. Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed, give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story. Edmund Crowley entered like a storm disguised in perfume and politeness. His boots shone brighter than the silver coins he carried, and his smile was the kind that promised comfort while hiding a noose. Martha looked up from her worn counter, her hands trembling slightly over the rolls of cloth. He called her Madam Hale, his voice soaked in false sweetness. Such fine work, he said, fingers grazing the fabric as if blessing it. The Crown values loyal hearts, Mrs. Hale. You deserve better than struggle and silence. She wanted to believe him, that there could be mercy in the face of power. But behind his words she felt the shadow of control, the scent of betrayal wearing silk. Crowley spoke of partnership, of guaranteed trade, of protection. The words stung like salt on an open wound. For every colonist knew what that protection meant: obedience. The seal he laid on her counter bore the mark of the same king who had taken her husband's life. He pushed the paper closer. You'll never starve again, he whispered, eyes gleaming. Just sign, and you'll have liberty under British grace. Liberty. Twisted, counterfeit liberty. The kind sold to those too desperate to refuse. Martha's throat tightened. Outside, the street echoed with the laughter of redcoats mocking a barefoot boy waving a torn militia flag. She watched as the boy's pride was trampled under boots that claimed to bring order. Inside, Crowley smiled again. All I ask, he continued, is that you sell only to my company. No dealings with rebels or smugglers. The Crown rewards loyalty, Mrs. Hale, and punishes rebellion. His tone darkened on that last word, like a sermon promising damnation. Martha met his gaze. Behind her grief burned a fragile defiance. She thought of her husband's last words, written in a letter before his death. Freedom has a price, my love, but chains cost the soul. Her eyes fell on the parchment. The ink of the royal crest gleamed in the light, a symbol of humiliation and control. Around it she saw the reflection of her own face, tired, pale, but still alive, still unbroken. She lifted her chin, her voice steady but quiet. I'll think about it. Crowley bowed as if she'd already agreed. Do, he said, but think quickly. The tides of rebellion are not kind to those who hesitate. When he left, the shop felt colder. The wind pushed through the cracks of the door, carrying the distant sound of drums, British drums, marching through Hollowport. Like a reminder that every heartbeat belonged to the Crown, Martha closed her hand around the paper. Its edges cut her palm. A thin drop of blood marked the seal, a small, silent act of defiance. Outside she saw the boy again, his flag now torn to shreds. She called him over, handed him a strip of her best cloth, and whispered, "Sew it again. Stronger this time." The boy nodded, eyes wide with a light that hadn't yet died. And as the drums faded into the fog, Martha Hale began to feel something shift, a quiet, burning resolve rising from within her sorrow, a decision forming in the shadows of her heart. For every wound had a voice, every humiliation a seed. And in the silence of her little shop, the widow of Hollowport took her first step toward rebellion. Martha read the contract again, though her eyes barely saw the words. Her stomach ached from hunger. Her son's cough echoed from the back room, and the candle burned low beside her trembling hands. The paper smelled of wax and perfume, the scent of power. Crowley's words still hung in the air, smooth as silk, sharp as a blade. "You'll never starve again. Desperation is a cruel counselor." She looked at Jacob's frail body, his ribs rising and falling like the tide of her despair. What is dignity to a mother who watches her child fade? What is liberty when every door closes in hunger's face? She took the quill. Her fingers shook so violently the ink splattered on the parchment like dark blood. Crowley smiled, the kind of smile that feeds on surrender. His eyes gleamed with victory as her name took form, Martha Halley. With one signature, her life, her shop, her home were bound by gold and ink. He folded the paper carefully, sealing her future beneath the mark of the crown. "You've made a wise choice," he said, pocketing the document as though it were treasure. "The crown protects those who serve with obedience." The word obedience tasted like ash. She nodded silently, too drained to speak. He placed a few coins on the counter, pity disguised as generosity, and turned toward the door. Outside, his carriage waited, guarded by redcoats who smirked at the sight of her worn dress. One of them muttered, "Another colonist bought cheap." They laughed as they rode away. Martha's knees gave way. She sank to the floor, pressing her hands against the wood as though the earth itself could swallow her shame. Her husband had died for independence, and she had just sold their legacy for bread. The sound of the contract still echoed in her ears, the soft scratch of the pen that chained her spirit. That night, the storm came. Wind clawed at the shutters as Martha sat in silence, watching the candle die. Jacob slept, dreaming the dreams of the innocent. She stared at the royal seal pressed against the counter, its wax cracked where her blood had dried. The deal was done, but something inside her refused to stay buried. In the following days, Crowley's men arrived often, inspecting, counting, demanding. They treated her shop as theirs, the goods as property of the crown. Each visit stripped away another layer of her dignity. Once, when she refused to kneel to a drunken officer, he struck her cheek with his glove. "Ungrateful widow," he sneered. "You belong to England now." That night she did not weep. She stared into the mirror and saw not a broken woman, but a spark, faint, yet alive. The humiliation had transformed into something colder, sharper. The shame became defiance. She began to notice things, secret meetings behind the tavern, whispers of rebellion traveling through the fog, messages hidden inside bolts of fabric. One evening, as she closed her shop, a stranger appeared at her door. A man in a rough coat, his accent American, his gaze steady. He spoke softly. "Mrs. Hale, I knew your husband." He laid a small pouch on the counter. Inside, a medal, the emblem of the local militia. "He died for liberty. But his fight isn't over. Neither is yours." The words struck like thunder. She looked down at her scarred hands, at the fabric of her trade, thread and cloth, simple tools, yet capable of carrying secrets. A decision began to form, rising from pain and memory. The contract that enslaved her might yet become the instrument of her awakening. In the heart of Hollowport, where loyalty was sold and freedom whispered in the shadows, Martha Hale took her first step toward redemption. Her journey was no longer one of survival, but of justice, a quiet rebellion stitched in secrecy, born from betrayal and bound for transformation. Comment: I stand with the Patriots. The morning sun rose pale over Hollowport, its light weak against the gray mist that clung to the harbor. Martha opened her stall as she did every day, her fingers stiff from the cold, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Business had been slow, too slow. The whispers about her, about Crowley's deal, had begun to spread. Some called her a traitor, others pitied her. None truly knew the price she had paid. Then came the sound she dreaded most, the march of boots, British boots. The rhythm of domination echoed through the narrow street as redcoats pushed through the crowd, clearing a path with their rifles. At their head walked Edmund Crowley, his powdered wig untouched by the damp air, his expression carved in arrogance. He carried a parchment in his hand, stamped with the royal seal, that same cursed emblem that had once promised safety. "Martha Halley," his voice cut through the murmurs. "By order of the crown, your goods are forfeit. You stand accused of trade without tax and of selling cloth to rebels." The market froze. Farmers, wives, fishermen, all turned their eyes toward her. Martha stepped forward, trembling but defiant. "That's a lie," she said, her voice cracking but steady. "Every piece I sold was counted. You know that." Crowley smirked, lifting the parchment. "The law knows only what it is told, and it tells me you are guilty." The soldiers began tearing through her stall. Bales of cloth ripped apart, spools of thread spilled into the mud. The bright colors, red, blue, white, were trampled beneath black boots. Martha lunged forward, trying to save a roll of linen, but a soldier shoved her to the ground. Laughter rose from the onlookers. Someone muttered, "That's what happens to those who defy the crown." She tried to rise, but an officer blocked her path. He was young, his face smooth and cruelly indifferent. He looked down at her with contempt and spat at her feet. "A rebel's woman deserves no mercy." The words struck deeper than any blow. Her husband's memory, her sacrifice, her quiet endurance, all mocked in one sentence. Crowley turned to the crowd with theatrical sorrow. "You see, good people, rebellion begins in small acts. Deceit, disobedience, pride. We must cut it out before it spreads." He raised his hand, and a soldier slashed through the last of her fabrics with a bayonet. The sound of tearing cloth filled the air like the cry of something dying. The people watched in silence, some with pity, others with fear, none with courage enough to intervene. Martha knelt among the ruins of her labor. Mud stained her dress, and the fragments of her work lay scattered like ashes after a fire. Crowley approached, lowering his voice. "You should have signed another contract, Mrs. Hale. There was still a way to save yourself." She looked up at him, her eyes hollow but burning. "You've taken everything," she whispered, "but not my soul." He laughed softly, stepping back. "Souls don't feed the hungry. Remember that." Then he turned, his cloak brushing the mud as he walked away, leaving her broken before the watching town. That night, Holloport's market stood empty. The air smelled of rain and smoke. Martha sat alone in her ruined stall, the lamp flickering beside her. The humiliation still clung to her skin like dirt that would not wash away. Yet somewhere within that shame, a new strength began to breathe. She thought of the widow she had been, the victim she had become, and the woman she could still be. The soldiers had burned her dignity in public, but from the ashes rose something else: resolve. Every act of degradation had stripped her of fear, until nothing remained but truth. The next morning, before dawn, Martha gathered what scraps of cloth survived. She sewed in silence, her hands guided by purpose, not trade. Each stitch carried defiance. Each thread whispered rebellion. The colors she chose were not random: crimson for sacrifice, white for hope, blue for the dream of liberty. As the first light touched Hollowport, she hung the finished piece behind her stall, a banner stitched from ruin, quiet yet bold. No words, only colors. But every soul who passed felt its meaning. The soldiers would come again. Crowley would demand her submission. But the widow of Hollowport had crossed the line between survival and resistance. Her journey had entered its darkest hour, the hour before transformation. The knock came long after midnight, harsh, unrelenting, the kind that announces power, not presence. Martha woke to the sound of boots outside her door and the sharp command of English voices. Jacob stirred beside the hearth, startled. Before he could stand, the door burst open. Redcoats filled the room, rifles gleaming under the lamplight. Their captain, pale and arrogant, stepped forward. "Jacob Hawley," he declared, "you are under arrest for aiding smugglers and traitors to His Majesty." Martha's heart stopped. "That's madness!" she cried, clutching her son's arm. "He's just a boy. He's done nothing." But the officer ignored her. Two soldiers seized Jacob, forcing his hands behind his back. The boy struggled, fear in his eyes, mud splattering as they dragged him toward the door. Crowley's voice descended from above, calm and venomous. He stood on his balcony, watching as if it were theater. A glass of wine glinted in his hand. "Business is cruel, Mrs. Haley," he said. "Pray for your son, not for justice." The words sliced deeper than any blade. Martha lunged forward, clawing at the soldiers' coats, screaming Jacob's name as he was pulled into the rain-soaked street. The boy's cry echoed through Hollowport before a blow silenced him. The neighbors watched from behind shuttered windows, their silence heavy with cowardice. Not one dared to speak. Martha fell to her knees in the mud. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked in rain and humiliation. The officer sneered down at her. "You should have taught him loyalty, woman." Then he turned, leaving her in the darkness. The door slammed. The boots faded. Only the storm remained. She stayed there for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones. Lightning flashed across the harbor, illuminating the British flag waving above the barracks, the place where her son was taken. She thought of the paper she had signed, the false promises, the slow betrayal that had devoured her life piece by piece. Now, it had taken her child. When dawn came, she rose from the mud like something reborn. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. She walked through the ruined market, past the same men and women who had once pitied her. No one spoke. They looked away. Shame had made them blind. At the edge of town, an old fisherman stopped her. "They took him to the fort," he whispered. "No trial. The boy won't last there." His voice cracked with fear, but Martha only nodded. Her silence frightened him. There was something different in her, something that no humiliation could break. That night she went to her shop and lit a single candle. On the table lay remnants of her cloth, torn and stained. She reached for her sewing needle and began to work, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. Between the folds of fabric, she hid small slips of parchment, messages meant for those who still dared to dream of liberty. Her home became a passage, her trade a disguise. Beneath the eyes of the enemy, she sewed rebellion into every thread. Farmers came for repairs. Soldiers came for uniforms. None saw the hidden truth stitched beneath their buttons and hymns. But every stitch was also a prayer, for Jacob, for her husband, for a land stripped of its dignity but not its soul. The widow of Holoport was no longer a victim. She had become something the Empire could not see, a spark beneath the ashes. Days later, a whisper reached her. A group of patriots was planning an escape from the fort. Her heart pounded as she heard the name among the prisoners, Jacob Hale. Hope returned, sharp and dangerous. She knew what she had to do. Martha Hale's journey was no longer about survival. It was about justice, the kind that no king could buy, no merchant could twist, no army could silence. The widow would fight not with weapons, but with faith, cunning, and the quiet fury of a mother betrayed. The shop was silent except for the wind pressing against the broken windows. Shadows trembled along the walls where light once lived. Martha knelt before the ashes of her husband's portrait. The frame charred and splintered from a fire long ago, the night she had almost given up. Her fingers traced the burned edges as if they could still feel his warmth. "You died for freedom," she whispered, her voice cracked, almost broken. "And now they cage our boy." Her words dissolved into the still air. For a moment there was nothing, only the slow dripping of rain through the roof, falling on the floorboards like the rhythm of grief. She wanted to pray, but her lips refused. The prayers of the faithful had built no bridges, freed no prisoners, stopped no soldiers. Heaven had grown silent. The world below demanded action. She rose, trembling but upright. Her tears no longer fell from weakness, but from fire, the painful rebirth of conviction. In the mirror behind the counter, she no longer saw a widow. She saw a soldier, unarmed yet unafraid. Her faith had changed form. It no longer sought deliverance, but purpose. Her hands, the same that had sewn for the Empire, would now stitch for liberty. The old Bible lay open on her table. Its pages were torn and damp. The ink faded, but a single verse remained legible. "The truth shall make you free." Martha read it again and again, the words burning deeper each time. Truth, not vengeance, not blind rage. The truth of what the crown had done to her people, to her husband, to her child. That was the weapon she would wield. She began collecting scraps of paper, bits of cloth, anything that could carry a message. By candlelight she wrote names, routes, the locations of British stores and secret gatherings she had overheard during her forced dealings with Crowley's men. Her hands shook, but her resolve did not. Each line written was a rebellion born in silence. Outside, Holoport slept under curfew. The redcoats patrolled the muddy streets, their laughter echoing through the fog like ghosts of tyranny. Martha watched from the window, her candle hidden, her heart steady. She saw their arrogance, their ease, the way they believed the town already broken. They didn't see her. They never saw the poor, the grieving, the silent. Yet it was among those they crushed that the soul of independence began to breathe again. She worked until dawn. When the candle burned to its final inch, she wrapped the finished letters in cloth and sealed them beneath a false floorboard. Each carried the mark of a simple seamstress, a harmless widow, invisible to the enemy. But beneath the needle's thread lived a network of resistance. As the first light crept through the fog, she heard the church bell, faint, distant. Once it had meant prayer. Now it sounded like a call to arms. Martha wiped her eyes, pressed her hand against her chest, and whispered to her husband's ashes, "They will not bury us in silence. Not you, not him, not me." Her transformation was complete. No longer a soul asking for mercy, she had become a voice, demanding truth. The journey ahead would demand everything: sacrifice, cunning, perhaps even her life. But she had made her decision. Freedom, she now knew, was not granted by kings. It was taken by the brave, built by the wounded, and carried by those too broken to fear the cost. And as the wind rose again, sweeping through the shattered shop, Martha Hale stood in its midst, a single figure against an empire, ready to turn her grief into a weapon of revelation. The storage chest creaked open, with a sound of memory, dry, reluctant, as if time itself resisted her hands. Dust rose like smoke, carrying the scent of years gone. Martha reached inside, pulling out old ledgers, scraps of faded cloth, fragments of a life once whole. Beneath a pile of shipping manifests lay something heavier, a folded sheet, sealed with dark red wax. Her breath caught. The seal was familiar. The same crest she had seen on Crowley's letters and contracts, the mark of the crown. Her fingers hesitated. The wax cracked beneath her thumb. Inside she found elegant handwriting, cold, deliberate, and unmistakable. Edmund Crowley. The merchant's tone bled arrogance even through ink. She read slowly, the words slicing into her like blades. It was a message to a British officer stationed in Holliport, a confession disguised as commerce. Crowley spoke of payments sent in secret, of shipments redirected, of bribes hidden behind trade agreements. He described how weapons meant for the militia were sold to pirates under the king's banner, how taxes collected from the colonists vanished into private accounts for loyal service. Every line burned hotter. Betrayal upon betrayal, masked as loyalty. Crowley had enslaved her under false laws, while he himself defied the very empire he worshipped. The revelation struck her like a revelation of sin, the hidden truth of all tyranny. It fed on lies dressed as order. Her hand trembled as she turned the page. At the bottom, a final sentence chilled her. Blood. If any inquiry arises concerning the widow Hale, dispose of her accordingly. Her usefulness is complete. The ink had bled slightly from moisture, but the meaning was clear. Her ruin had been planned. Her suffering, a tool. Even her husband's death, she now saw it differently. He had not fallen by chance. He had died because of men like Crowley, merchants of deceit, who profited from sacrifice and wrapped murder in the cloth of law. Martha's heart pounded. Her grief, her humiliation, all. The years of silence, they converged into a single moment of transformation. She was no longer merely a victim of cruelty. She was the keeper of truth. And truth, once exposed, could ignite revolutions. She folded the letter carefully, hiding it beneath her shawl. Outside, the harbor winds howled. The ships of the crown swayed under the storm, their flags snapping like whips against the rain. For the first time, she did not look away. Every lash of wind seemed to whisper the same word: justice. Martha lit a lantern and held the paper to the flame, studying the royal seal as it melted. She did not burn it, not yet. This was her weapon, her shield, her deliverance. The letter could destroy Crowley, and perhaps the entire command rotting above him. But to wield it, she would need allies, patriots who still believed that liberty was worth the risk. Her mind raced through the names whispered in secret: farmers who smuggled powder through grain barrels, blacksmiths who forged blades beneath candlelight, widows who carried messages sewn into hymns. The rebellion was alive, faint but breathing. And now she carried proof that could turn whispers into thunder. Rain hammered the roof. The lamp flickered. In that fragile light, Martha Hale made a decision, not of vengeance, but of destiny. She would bring the letter to those who could use it, even if it cost her life. The boy she had lost, the husband who had fallen, the countless nameless souls humiliated under British boots. All their pain demanded this act. She closed the chest, her hand steady. Behind her, the fire's reflection danced on the cracked walls, casting her shadow tall and defiant. The journey ahead would be perilous, but she had crossed the line where fear could not follow. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled once more, low, solemn, like the heartbeat of a nation awakening. And Martha Halley, widow of Hollowport, walked into the storm carrying the proof that could break an empire. Dawn found Hollowport wrapped in fog. The magistrate's office stood like a small stone judge against the gray. Martha walked the cobbles with the letter pressed to her breast. Her feet were steady. Her hands did not shake. The sea smelled of oil and old sorrow. Inside, the clerk glanced up. His eyes darted to the waxed seal, then away. Papers shifted under his inked fingers like timid birds. He swallowed. "Madame Halley," he whispered, voice thin. "That paper, if it reaches the wrong ears, could hang you." He looked at her as if pleading for mercy he did not dare offer. Martha straightened. The room was small, the light thin. She had stood in worse weather. "Then let it hang me," she said, the words leaving her like a blade. "But it will bury him." Her voice trembled, but her will did not. The clerk's face went white. He had seen men tremble under lesser threats. He had never seen a widow refuse fear. He slid the document across the desk with hands that betrayed him. "You must be careful. Mrs. Halley, the magistrate, answers to men with gold and titles. He answers to Crowley." The name fell like a stone. Outside, Hollowport breathed in dread. Farmers kept their hats low. Old women crossed themselves. Children peered from shutters. Word traveled quick where hope flickered. The market murmured as if a storm approached. The merchants' balconies gathered silhouettesmen in powdered wigs and fat collars, watching for the spectacle. Martha pushed the door open and faced the magistrate. He was a man of middling years and middling courage. His robes hung like the law itself, grand but empty. He raised an eyebrow and offered civility that reeked of calculation. She placed the letter on his desk. The seal glinted. He lifted the parchment with gloved fingers, reading the script that linked Crowley to theft, bribery, and the sale of arms to pirates under the king's name. His lips moved. He swallowed again. Authority trembled where ink could reach. "You understand the risk," he said. "Accusing a man of Mr. Crowley's station, such charges require proof. You could be ruined, Mrs. Halley. You could be executed for forging a royal document." Martha met his gaze. She felt the weight of every insult thrown at her in the market. She remembered the officer's boot on Jacob's throat. She tasted the wine from Crowley's balcony. Her heart was a slow, fierce drum. "Proof is here," she said. "His hand, his orders, his intent. He wrote to an officer. He planned my ruin." Her words fell plain and hard. "He sold arms to those who prey on our coasts. He took taxes and hid the rest. He traded in betrayal while preaching loyalty. That is treason." The magistrate's face flickered between duty and self-preservation. He glanced toward the window where soldiers watched like carrion. He felt the pressure of the crown's shadow. His pen hovered. The law bent where coins pressed. Martha thought of the men in the fields. Simple farmers who could not read the ledgers, but felt the weight of ruined harvests. She thought of militia lads who had nothing but honor and were left to starve. She thought of old Thomas at the docks who lost his savings to false tariffs. All of them carried humiliation like a wound. All of them had given something for the hope of dignity. She closed her eyes for a breath. Her decision was no longer private. It belonged to the town that had watched her kneel and choose shame. It belonged to the memory of her husband and to the son dragged into the mud. She opened her eyes and spoke with the clarity of one who has crossed into danger for truth. "If the law protects the guilty," she said, "then the law is dead. I will not bury my child under its corpse." Her words struck the room like a bell. A clerk coughed. The magistrate folded the paper slowly. His fingers trembled at the seal. Outside, a coach rolled past and the sound paused like a beast listening. Somewhere on a balcony, a glass tapped as Crowley watched the day unfold. Martha stepped back from the desk. She did not plead. She did not beg. She had given the magistrate the letter and the choice. The scales of justice would tilt by hands she could not control. That did not change the path she had chosen. As she left the office, the fog seemed to part just enough to reveal the harbor. The town watched her pass. Some bowed their heads. Some clenched their fists. In her chest, sorrow and resolve met and fused into something dangerous. She carried no sword. Her weapon was truth, her comrades, or the oppressed who still dared to whisper liberty in the dark. The road ahead would be hard. The cost would demand sacrifice. But the hidden truth now walked free from the chest and into the light. The courtroom smelled of damp paper and fear. Men whispered behind their powdered wigs, their words curdled by curiosity and contempt. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as Martha Hale walked through the heavy doors. Her steps echoed against the marble floor, slow, steady, unbroken. She carried no counsel, no guard, no husband to defend her name. Only the letter, the proof, the truth. At the front, Edmund Crowley stood among his peers, merchants, officers, nobles who fed on colonial labor and called it order. His powdered hair gleamed beneath the light, his rings flashing as he gestured to the magistrate. He looked certain, untouchable, the embodiment of arrogance wrapped in silk. Then he saw her. His smile faltered. Martha did not bow. She walked to the center of the hall and unrolled the letter. The sound of parchment tearing through silence was sharper than any sword. Her voice, though worn by nights of grief, carried with the weight of conviction. "This letter," she said, "was written by Edmund Crowley to a British officer of the Crown. It speaks of theft, deceit, and betrayal." Murmurs rippled through the room. Crowley's eyes darkened, his mouth twitching with restrained fury. "Nonsense," he barked, but his voice trembled. "She forges words now? A widow's." "Delusion." Martha raised her hand, cutting through his protest. "He sold weapons meant for our militia to pirates," she continued, reading line by line. "He took taxes from the poor and filled his own coffers. He bribed officers to silence his crimes. And when I refused his control, he ordered my ruin." The room turned still. Each accusation fell like a hammer. The faces of merchants grew pale. Even the magistrate shifted uneasily in his chair. The clerk swallowed hard. Every word she spoke exposed another crack in the empire's illusion of righteousness. Crowley lunged forward, red with fury. "Lies. The woman seeks revenge for her own disgrace," he shouted, pointing at her like a viper. "She is no patriot. She is a desperate beggar seeking martyrdom." Martha faced him, her eyes calm, her dignity unshaken. "I seek no glory," she said softly. "Only truth. And truth does not beg." The magistrate motioned for silence. He took the letter with trembling hands, his eyes moving quickly over the text, his face drained of color. "Guards," he murmured. "Seize Edmund Crowley." Gasps swept the hall. Crowley turned, disbelief etched in every line of his face. "You dare?" he hissed, backing away as two soldiers approached. "You will regret this, Haley. The Crown knows its friends. I am the law here." The soldiers gripped his arms. His wine-stained cuffs tore as he struggled, shouting curses that drowned beneath the noise of the crowd. The same crowd that had once scorned Martha now watched in silent awe as power crumbled before them. As they dragged him through the doors, his voice echoed one last time. "You'll hang for this, woman. You and your cursed name." Martha stood motionless. The echoes of his rage faded into the sea wind that slipped through the open window. For the first time in years, she felt air in her lungs that did not taste of fear. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was warning. The Crown did not forgive humiliation. The punishment for rebellion came not in words, but in blood. The magistrate dismissed the crowd in haste, his voice trembling as he ordered the guards to secure the evidence. Martha turned to leave, but as she passed the doorway, she caught sight of the soldiers outside, more of them than before. Their red coats glimmered in the morning light, their eyes fixed on her. She knew then that her act of courage had changed everything. She had struck a wound into the Empire's pride, and it would bleed. Her journey was not ending, it was only descending into its darkest hour. For truth had power, but power had claws. She stepped into the street, the crowd parting before her like waves before a ship. Some whispered prayers, others lowered their gaze. But a few, a brave few, raised their heads and nodded. Something had begun in Holliport, something that could not be silenced. Martha Hale walked toward the harbor, her shawl heavy with rain and resolve. The sky above was dark, the kind of sky that comes before a storm. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that cleanses. The night after the trial, Holliport burned with whispers. Some called her brave, others called her doomed. In the harbor, torches flickered along the docks as a British ship prepared to sail, its flag limp in the cold wind. Shackled among the officers stood Edmund Crowley, his powdered hair matted, his face pale with disbelief. He shouted as they dragged him aboard, cursing the name of the widow who had undone him. His voice, once gilded with power, now broke against the tide like glass against stone. From the cliffs above, Martha watched in silence. No triumph rose in her chest, only a heavy calm, the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. The cost had been terrible, and she knew it was not over. Justice, when born from oppression, never came without sacrifice. When dawn came, the smoke was already rising from her street. The shop was gone, burned to the ground by unseen hands in the night. The smell of ash clung to the air, the remnants of her life scattered like black snow. The sign bearing her husband's name lay in the mud, split in two. Crowley's allies had struck their final blow before leaving the town, eager to remind her that the Empire's reach did not end with one man's fall. She did not weep. She stood before the ruins, her hands raw, her face streaked with soot, her heart silent but unbroken. From the corner of the alley came a voice, thin, trembling. "Mother." Jacob stepped out of the shadows, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow but alive, the boy she had thought lost. His wrists bore the marks of iron, but his spirit had not been broken. He stumbled toward her, and she caught him in her arms. For a long time neither spoke. The silence between them said everything: pain, loss, survival. When he finally looked up, his voice cracked. "We have nothing left." Martha brushed his hair from his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the dirt along his cheek. "We have our name," she said softly, "and our freedom." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a nation yet unborn. Around them, the ashes of her shop still smoldered. In those ruins lay every humiliation she had endured, every sacrifice made for dignity. Yet from those ashes rose something greater, the spirit of defiance that no empire could crush. As the wind swept through the broken street, church bells began to toll. The sound was slow, heavy, echoing through Hollowport like a hymn for the reborn. People emerged from their homes, their faces pale but changed. They had seen a woman stand against power and live. They had seen truth defeat gold. They had seen a name once cursed become a banner of courage. An old man knelt beside the road, gathering a piece of charred fabric from the ruins, a fragment of Martha's final banner, still faintly marked by the threads of red, white, and blue. He held it to his chest. Others followed, silent, reverent. In that moment, the widow of Hollowport ceased to be a victim. She became a symbol. The Empire would remember her defiance as an insult. The people would remember it as a beginning. The tide rolled in, washing over the scorched stones, carrying the last traces of smoke into the sea. Martha turned to Jacob, her arms still around him. "They took what they could touch," she whispered, "but what we carry, they will never understand." Far above them, the church bell continued its slow song. The sound reached the hills, the fields, the farmlands beyond Hollowport, and with it traveled the first quiet notes of rebellion. In the age of kings, one poor widow had stood against corruption and proved that truth, not power, shapes a nation. Right, the flame of freedom lives in me. The sea wind swept through Hollowport one last time, carrying with it the scent of smoke and salt, the memory of all that had burned and all that still endured. Martha Hale stood upon the cliff where her husband had once sworn his oath to liberty, the horizon washed in crimson light. Her hands were scarred, her heart torn, yet her spirit stood taller than the empire that had tried to break her. Around her lay ashes, but within her, a fire that would not die. The people began to gather behind her, fishermen, farmers, widows, and soldiers too young to forget their shame. They came not as servants of a crown, but as witnesses to a truth reborn in their midst. In silence they watched the tide erase the last traces of tyranny's mark upon their town. No flag of the king flew that morning. Only the wind carried the widow's defiance. Martha looked to her son. Jacob's eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with something deeper, conviction. He took her hand, and for a long moment they said nothing. Words were too small for what had been lost and what had begun. In that silence lived the sound of generations yet to come, voices that would one day rise for dignity, not for gold. The cost of freedom had been carved into their flesh, into the soil beneath their feet. But the lesson of Hollowport would not fade. that truth can outlive power, that courage can outshine cruelty, and that even a poor widow, armed only with conscience, can shift the course of history. As the bell tolled across the harbor, Martha whispered, "They can burn our homes, they can chain our sons, but they will never silence a soul that has known liberty." Her words drifted through the wind, carried far beyond the port, beyond the reach of kings. And so the story of Holoport became legend, a tale of sacrifice and revelation, of one woman's defiance becoming the spark of a greater flame, the flame that burns in every heart that refuses submission, the flame that whispers, even in the darkest hour, that independence is not granted, it is earned in pain and guarded in honor. If this story reached your heart, let its spirit stay alive. Leave your mark below, a pledge, a memory, a spark of the same fire that once burned in Martha's soul. Right, the flame of freedom burns in me. And if you wish to keep walking this path of courage and sacrifice, there is another story waiting, another soul who chose honor over comfort. Click and continue with me, where liberty still finds its voice in the hearts of the forgotten.